So I'm an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and I don't think I've ever said yes to an invitation to moderate a panel more quickly. Cathy's a journalist I hugely admire. I'm often jealous of her scoops, and I think the Royal Television Society agreed that her investigation, which formed a big part of you winning Network Journalist of the Year, was one of the biggest stories, certainly in the past few years in British journalism. So I just kind of want to start at the beginning with the tip-off. Can you tell us a bit about the note that triggered the whole investigation? You nearly missed it, right?
Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you for that very kind intro. I'm an incredibly illustrious company to be in. And, you know, I feel very much kind of I am not worthy, really, with those incredible names that we heard who have been in this spot before. And also just like to point out, I'm not from North London, I'm from South London. In fact, this is very much my neighbourhood. So, no, that's okay. But I feel very strongly about this, obviously.
North London over here.
By the way, am I using this mic? Yes, this is just for recording, isn't it? Yeah, sorry, just checking on the technicalities. Right, get back to your question, because it's very annoying when people don't answer the question, which I've just done. So, yeah, the tip-off about the church story, yes, I nearly missed it because, you know, no one really tips you off very often by post these days, but this was a tip-off that came 9 years ago now in a letter. My informant explained that he had watched an investigative piece that actually we briefly worked on together, didn't we? Which was about a British sex offender who had, in the way of British sex offenders, had his abuse exported out to Kenya, and he'd abused children living on the streets in Kenya. And I'd done an investigation on this with producer Wild the Boos. And my informant in the letter about the church had seen this documentary and said, I think I may have information on a similar note, this time someone who's abused within the Church of England, and the church has covered it up for many, many decades, and, you know, perhaps we could meet for a coffee. It was a bit cryptic. I mean, I've actually given you more information there than was in this letter, but all I knew was there was a sort of potentially interesting story. And obviously people tip you off the whole time on stories, and 9 times out of 10, I'm afraid it's a dead end or a red herring. So I didn't have high hopes. We met for a coffee, and the man who'd written the letter used to at one point work for the BBC, but had been hired by the Ewan Trust, which runs these, or did run these summer holiday camps, and it was a kind of associated with the Church of England, and he'd been hired by them essentially to sort of do a PR job on this terrible problem that they knew they had, which was that one of their people had, John Smyth, namely, had abused these boys over many years. He'd been accused of that. And they needed to work out what to do about this and what to do about these reports of abuse. Sorry, I'm rambling on now, so please cut in with any questions you want. So this man had been hired. He's called Andrew Greystone. He'd been hired by them. He essentially blew the whistle, didn't want to, whitewash their reputation, and decided to bring the story to me instead. So that's where it started. That's where the tip-off came from. I almost didn't get his letter because it went to the wrong office. It went to Channel 4 headquarters instead of ITN, where I work. So when it finally found its way to me, it was many weeks after he'd written it, and he thought I wasn't interested. So thank God he didn't go to someone else with the story. But eventually we met for coffee, and pretty much minutes after he'd arrived, he'd produced this dossier of evidence, which was a secret report that had been written back in the 1980s, which set out in pretty unsparing detail the scale and nature of John Smyth's abuse, the number of beatings that he'd meted out to individuals over a period of years, and it was there in black and white. So it was, in a way, a story that was handed to me on a plate, and then it was a question of doing the investigation behind that document to substantiate it.
I think you're doing yourself a slight disservice there by saying it was handed to you on a plate. But, the documentary evidence is always the holy grail of investigative journalism, but it's not enough to tell the whole story, right? So I'm curious, what were your next steps in terms of standing the story up, particularly around kind of tracking down and convincing sources to speak.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, if you're given a document that sort of sets out wrongdoing in black and white, that's a huge boost if you're an investigative journalist, because very often it's not that easy, is it? However, as you say, it's one thing to have these, beatings set out in black and white, the nature of how they were done, the number of thrashes with this improvised cane that had been carried out over a period of years, but then to find out the victims at the heart of that, how it had happened, why it had happened, and that's what we proceeded to do over a period of months. In a funny kind of way, some of it had been alluded to in a book by former head teacher of Winchester College. He'd talked in sort of veiled terms about this. So again, that was a sort of another little piece of evidence that we were able to then unravel and go to people who'd been to that school and find them online and work out from the dates who would have been there and when and where they then went. So having come back to the office with this incredibly important piece of evidence, we then proceeded to put together a team, and investigations so often teamwork, and I couldn't have done it without these incredible producers. Tom Stone was one of the main guys also, who just poured through the evidence and then pieced together lots of emailing contacts. He turned up at a church one day to try and talk to a vicar who was so terrified of the repercussions if he spoke to us. So people took a lot of convincing to speak to us and trust us.
And I just want to pick up on that, because that was one of the bits that really stuck out for me. So this was a vicar who kind of was ignoring emails, calls, right? And then your producer, as I understand it, found out he was holding a sermon and just turned up to it, right?
Yeah. So he, a lot of people, obviously, when you get in contact with them, they don't want to talk. So yeah, he'd actually turned up to his Sunday service. Tom turned up, and obviously, the vicar had to have a conversation. He wouldn't go on camera, but he did have a useful off-the-record conversation with him, which, again, it was sort of baby steps, just progressing step by step. And there was a bit of a breakthrough when Mark Stibbe, who was one of Smyth's victims, he wasn't responding to Tom's emails. So Tom was like, okay, why don't you get in touch, see whether he'll talk to you. And fortunately, he was a bit of a fan of Channel 4 News. So when I got in touch with him and said, look, can we meet? It'd be just great to have a completely confidential conversation. And we met in the Starbucks off the M25. He brought his wife along. We just had a very gentle conversation. I told him what we were doing. And really, we probably talked for about an hour. And by the end of that hour, I think he was reassured. There was a sort of bond of trust that had developed fairly quickly. And by the end of that conversation, he actually moved from sort of being interested in what we were doing to being prepared to speak on camera, face to camera, about what he'd endured. So that was a huge breakthrough.
Do you have any tips on winning over the trust of, particularly I'm thinking, a lot of the victims of Smyth were particularly, they were dealing with a lot of trauma, and there must have been special challenges in trying to win their trust, trying to gain their trust?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because so often, as I say, we had this document, but we wouldn't have been able to put anything on TV without the victims at the heart of this story. These are men who were abused as young men, late teens, early 20s, we're talking, and they've lived with this abuse for decades. And so to win their trust is a question of, being very gentle and just taking it very slowly. But also, I feel very grateful that Channel 4 News has a real reputation for investigative journalism and trustworthy journalism. So you're starting from a good position there. But I think also I'm sometimes quite surprised by, in this age where we're all on our phones, we're always doing everything by WhatsApp, I can see someone on the phone back there, I'm not going to name a shame, but, it's like we're always glued to our screens. And so actually to have that face-to-face contact is just so crucial. And just to listen to them and just for them to know that they're being listened to after all these years where the church didn't listen to them and, people they complained to multiple times didn't listen. So I think just to be very driven by them, to take it very slowly, not to be too pushy, you know, one of the great things about having an investigations team in Channel 4 News is that you can spend months investigating something, and that, well, you know, in the end we spent years doing this. And I think that's a luxury that I know, you know, if you're an online journalist, for example, you might not have that. You might be under pressure of deadlines more, but I think that is, you do need to take it slowly and just piece it together. And, you know, obviously the legal hurdles are enormous, and, you know, lawyers will mostly, for this kind of story where the alleged perpetrator is still alive, you're making very serious accusations, the lawyers will usually ask for, you know, at least 2 victims face to camera, which is quite a big ask when you're talking, you know, that's a huge pressure for them. But we did have 2 victims who were prepared to go on camera, Mark Stibbe and Richard Gittins. Both very different people, very different stories. They approached it in very different ways. They dealt with it very differently. But we also had a huge number of anonymous witnesses who did anonymous interviews. Graham has still not revealed his name, but I'm still in regular touch with him. Andy Morse, who was anonymous when we did the report, but then he's now gone public not long after we did our report, actually. And he was really crucial because he was one of the victims who had tried to take his own life. And that was really a sort of turning point where the powers that be could have realised how horrendous this abuse was. And that was really when the cover-up entered a kind of devastating new phase. So he was crucial. And you know, just the courage of these people to speak, that it still amazes me that they agreed. And it's fantastic that they did, because without them, we would never have got any kind of accountability. I just feel terrible that we never got justice for them while John Smyth was alive, because he died in 2018. There was a window there. We could have, you know, the police were investigating, they were preparing to interview him, and then he died.
I'm glad you brought up the legals just then, because it's something I wanted to ask about. How much was, or I guess, in terms of the challenges and kind of maybe why it took a little bit longer, how much of that was to do with kind of the legal challenges of telling, you know, a really libelous story against not only a really powerful institution that's damaging to the Church of England, but also this guy was a barrister.
Yeah, the hurdles are pretty huge. I'm going to take, there's sort of 3 separate things there. The Ewan Trust was very robust legally, pointing out that none of the abuse took place at their summer camps. Also, Ewan is now called Titus Trust, so, you know, they were keen to distance themselves from any allegations of wrongdoing, and they deny any wrongdoing took place on their premises. So that was, you know, we had to be very clear about that sort of, I think we weren't clear in our own heads, the difference between Titus Trust and Ewan Trust, and, you know, those kind of legal niceties. Yeah, I thought that Smyth would push back very strongly, being a notorious QC. And that's what fascinated me when we tracked him down in Bristol. It fascinated me when I did a doorstep with him, which, you know, you can see online, we've replayed it many times. And he didn't deny the allegations initially. He said, you know, I'm not talking about that. And then he proceeded to talk about it and what, in his view, happened. So that was kind of extraordinary to me, that moment that, you know, I had my cameraman, Simon Vatcher, was walking backwards this whole time. And we probably went on for about nearly 15 minutes, this doorstep, which is very unusual. You know, I'd expected him to, you know, not say anything and then dive into the underground car park outside his house. And he didn't. So that was interesting. And then the church, again, that was a whole different kettle of fish, because when we went to the church for the right of reply 48 hours before, I mean, when I was on newspapers, you know, we gave people maybe a few hours to respond, but TV, different standard, 48 hours. So the day before we were due to put our report out, the church actually came out with a statement and said, we're putting out a statement on Channel 4 News' report on John Smyth, so they had the first say before we put out our report. So we had to move very swiftly to then
basically go live outside Lambeth Palace and trail our report and say, we're going to put out a full report tomorrow, which we did. And then, after that, it was a question of doorstepping the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and, so we had to contend with an organisation that, and this has been part of the story, has been absolutely jealous of preserving its reputation, and the victims say, well, that's partly why they never got any accountability or justice from the church, because the church was so determined to put its own reputation above them. I mean, that's something the church has always denied, but I would say the way they've handled both this and then the leak of the subsequent Macon review, which followed our investigation, it does look as if the church, it's got an incredible sort of PR operation that they're very aggressive at pushing back at anything that's going to sort of chisel away at their reputation.
And on that doorstep point, because it was an extraordinary doorstep of Smyth, and if any of you haven't seen it, it's worth watching, because it's really it's a great lesson in how to do a good doorstep. I'm curious about the behind-the-scenes stuff that went on, both like, how did you manage to do that doorstep, both kind of legally, editorially, and also just logistically, like tracking him down?
Yeah, no, that was, again, it's teamwork, a lot of it. Joe Brabkin, who was running the investigations unit at the time, he was actually born in South Africa. Smyth was living in South Africa by this point, and so Job got in touch with an investigative journalist out in South Africa who did a bit of digging around about what Smyth was doing at this point, and just found out that he was coming over to the UK. So then we managed to find out where he was staying in the UK, and then laid wait. Didn't have much hope of getting him. I mean, I thought we'd be there for hours. In fact, just before he emerged, I'd gone and got some coffees and biscuits in, and we were just sort of sitting down for a long wait in the car. And we had someone watching on the corner of the street, and they just quickly called us and said, he's coming out. So we had to just, toss the coffee in the air and jump out. And, Simon Vatcher, the cameraman, did an incredible job, because actually I think that's much more difficult than firing the questions, is walking backwards, not falling over, keeping everything in focus and in shot. I mean, and again, the teamwork element is important, because I think now there is this move towards reporting and shooting and doing everything yourself. But the drawback with that is, I would not have been able to get such a great shot. I mean, I couldn't have even begun to be honest. So I think there's something, it comes down to really great resourcing in investigative journalism, and that's something that is a sort of dwindling priority, really.
And legally, I'm just curious. Like, did you have to show you'd approached him for comment already, and he hadn't responded before doorstepping him, or given the circumstances, you didn't need to do that?
Well, actually, I need to check on that, because something's come up recently, which is an investigation we're doing on a very similar story, a fascinating story that I can't really say any more about, but the question has come up, do we need to go to this other person we're pursuing for comment first? And I don't believe we did with John Smyth, and I need to check with the lawyer why that was. Was it because of the nature of the allegations? I can't actually remember, because normally their protocol would be to go for comment first. But I'm not sure that we did with John Smyth, and obviously it was kind of crucial that there was an element of surprise in the doorstep, otherwise I think he might have dived into the underground car park. So I need to check on that before I pursue this other alleged perpetrator.
It might be a bit weedy, but I'm always fascinated by doorsteps.
Yes, no, exactly.
So what happened when the investigation first aired? Like, did it immediately make an impact?
It did, because of the church actually putting out this statement beforehand, that sort of intrigued everybody. And then when we put out our report, it was a really weighty, thorough film, and I think that sort of then stimulated interest. Plus, Justin Welby came out he'd been speaking on LBC. LBC had, seen our report, and they questioned him about it, and then he came outside the building, and I was there with a whole load of other journalists, and we did a sort of doorstep. So again, that sort of fueled it. And then we had a second day film, which was all about the abuse that had happened in Zimbabwe. So, it's kind of already like this guy had been exported basically from the UK to Zimbabwe. The problem had been, sort of shoved onto someone else's territory. And the fact that the Church of England and, Winchester College hadn't tackled him in the UK meant that he was then free to abuse other young men in Zimbabwe, and one young man was found dead in a swimming pool. So, there was a sort of... It was incremental, and then we went out to South Africa to see if we could find Smyth again, to get him to respond to, what the church had been saying. And I think also the fact that Justin Welby, the way he handled it, also contributed to the sort of growing scandal around the church, which is ultimately one of the reasons why he resigned. Because just before he announced the Macon review, like an official investigation into the whole scandal, he agreed to do an interview with me on Channel 4. So this was 2 years after the initial report, and we'd kind of kept it bubbling away until then. And then when he came into the studio, he, again, sort of in his response, fueled the story, because he said, had I known how horrendous this was, I would, of course, have taken more action. And that interview then became quite a crucial part of the official investigation, because the official investigation by Macon disclosed that, well, actually, he did know how horrendous it was. And so that was one of many moments where the Archbishop of Canterbury was very, misleading in his statements, and that then contributed to the eventual resignation. Sorry, I hope I'm not going into too many, into the weeds of my investigation.
Let's be like the weeds, right? That was a huge interview. It ultimately led to his downfall. And I'm curious what kind of, how you got the interview and what kind of preparation goes into such a big interview like that.
I mean, I get interviews by badgering people relentlessly, basically, in the nicest possible way. The story had kind of gone away between 2017 when we aired it and 2019 when Justin Welby came into our studio. But I kept on, every few months I would go back to his, I got to know his one of his aides who was a vicar, still is a vicar. I got to know him quite well, and again, sort of won his trust that Justin Welby would get a fair hearing, and that's really important. That I didn't have an agenda. I had literally not an inkling that Welby would resign. That wasn't, I had no sort of axe to grind. I just wanted to probe him fully and fairly. So over the years, we, got to know each other quite well, and then he was in a position then to go, okay, fine, I promised you that interview. To be fair to him, he'd always promised it. Finally, he delivered on his promise. He comes in. Unfortunately for him, that interview sort of raised more questions than it answered. But then again, the story went quiet, because the Macon review was supposed to publish in just a few months, and it took 5 years. So in those 5 years, the victims were getting more and more frustrated that nothing had been done. Frankly, our news desk had sort of lost interest in the story because there wasn't a lot to say. So it wasn't until the end of last year, when the Macon review was due to publish, I got hold of a leaked copy. Again, I didn't actually have much confidence that the editor would be that interested by this point. It seemed like a long time ago since our investigation aired. But when I read that leaked copy and realised how devastating it was, I really sort of pushed hard for us to make a really big deal of it. And it was just before Trump got elected for the second time. It was a massively busy news agenda. Initially I emailed the editor and various other people. I didn't get a reply back for a few hours. So I got on the phone and said, look, I really think we're missing a trick if we don't go really big on this. Fair play to the editor and colleagues, that they were like, okay, fine, yeah, great, you got a point. I just cut and pasted the most devastating bits of the report to make my case. And put it all together, filmed it, and then again, the night before we were going to put it all out, because we'd had to go to the church again, to spike our guns, put out the Macon report, brought forward publication of it, and that was kind of when all hell broke loose, really. And again, to be fair to the church, Justin Welby agreed to do an interview. He didn't need to, but I'd been pressing him to do it, and that interview was followed by his resignation 5 days later, because
again, he angered the victims. He angered his colleagues in the church by saying, well, I'm not going to resign for this. And actually, he did.
Before it got to that kind of incredible, impactful point in the investigation, you'd spent 8 years, right, on and off, digging into this. How important do you think it is? How important do you think the slow burn is in investigative journalism to keep chipping away when the news agenda's moved on, when you're having to bang on your editor's door? How important is that for getting results?
I think it's so, persistence is sort of 85% of investigative journalism, I think. I've got a sort of list of stories. It's not very scientific, actually. I'm sure there's a better way of organising it, but it's just a Google Drive document, and I've got sort of different stories with different, developments and bits, and bits in purple which I've got to sort of follow up on. I mean, it's not rocket science, but just every few days, weeks, depending on what the rest of my time looks like, I go back to that document and keep on plugging away at different things. I've always got different sort of irons in the fire, and juggling different stories. And I think it is absolutely crucial, because if I hadn't got the leak of the Macon report, it would have just gone out, and it wouldn't have made much impact, and the victims would have been failed again. And actually just to keep on badgering, that's probably the most important thing, I think, as well as contacts. And it's kind of also, I think people do investigative journalism in so many different ways, and I think a lot of people now do a lot of data journalism, a lot of online journalism, and that's incredibly valid as well. I think the bedrock of my journalism is contacts, and just winning the trust of people and keeping in contact with them over the years. All the victims are constantly in touch with me, and I wouldn't have got the leak of the Macon report without that. So it's about people, really, for me.
I 100% agree with that. My editor, who is incredible at sourcing, he has this spreadsheet of sources he keeps, and he has this target every week. I mean, he's an editor now, he doesn't meet them, but when he was a reporter, of meeting 4 sources every week, 4 new sources, sorry.
I'd say that's new ones.
New
okay,
ones.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
I'd say 4 a week, that's a bit pathetic.
I'll tell him that before I get fired. But yeah, 4 new contacts, and then just checking in. I think the check-in is important, right? So they don't just feel you're giving them a call when you want something for a day story or whatever.
And I mean, that actually makes me feel a little bit guilty now, because I feel like I've been so busy recently, I haven't had a chance to do that. But, also because I have this hybrid role where I present 2 days a week, and then I also have my radio show, and then I do investigations. So I feel that I don't have that luxury of a nice clean slate this week to just bash the phones and, go and meet people. But that's if there's ever a quiet moment, that's what I do.
One of the things that struck out to me about your investigation making such a big splash last year was that it stood out amongst such a busy year of news. I mean, the news has felt relentless since about 2016, I think, but it was such a busy year of news, foreign news, yet here you are with this really important domestic story that cut through enough to make the huge impact it did, to lose the Archbishop of Canterbury, his job. Do you think, and yes, this is a bugbear of mine, but do you think it's become harder, or it's harder to hold institutions, powerful people to account when the news cycle, the daily news cycle, is just so relentless?
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt really pleased that a domestic story, in inverted commas, home news, had won these awards, because that is really, it sometimes feels, because there's so many extraordinary and horrendous things going on around the world, that does fill up the news agenda, and rightly so, because you can't be parochial about it. But I felt really proud of that a UK story had sort of cut through. I'm not sure that in terms of holding institutions to account, I think there are ways in which it's easier than it was, because the data-driven aspect of it. I think the way that it's harder for me is that people know how to avoid journalists and go to great lengths to do so. And they can hide behind lawyers. And so that's where I think it's hard. And so I suppose fair play to Justin Welby. He granted me 2 interviews, which proved to be his undoing. I think that's the hardest thing. I'm not sure, because in a way, yeah, sure, editors have short attention spans in some ways, and viewers do as well. So yeah, the caravan of news moves on, but it's our responsibility as investigative journalists to make sure that doesn't happen, and to go and knock on your editor's door and just go, as I did when I came back. I actually came back from the first meeting with this document that proved so damning for the church. And I mentioned it to a colleague who shall remain nameless, who said, oh, actually, I'm just a bit busy at the moment. And I was just so incensed that I just marched straight into the editor's office and said, this is an amazing story, we've got to do it, we've got to put resources into it. And the editor was like, you're right, great, let's do it now. And we did it now. So that, you got to badger people.
Thank you, Cathy. I think we'll both be down here if anyone wants to try and grab us afterwards. But thank you so much. And thanks to Cathy.